everyone. I'm Andrew Napier. I am a composer for visual media. I also make music under the name Noumenah. And with me, I have Cory for this video.
Hello. Good to be here with you, Andrew.
Yes.
I compose music under the name Lamniformes, usually in a rock band setting, but as I think we're going to go over today, we're starting to push that in a few new and interesting directions with your help.
Yeah. Very cool. Very exciting. So you went out, it was this summer, right? Mm-hmm. Reaching out to different artists to basically remix one of your songs from your album.
Yeah, I put out an album in 2019 called Sisyphean, and it's a heavy metal record that has feet in a few different worlds, kind of crosses over into indie rock and post-rock and all of that sort of good vibey stuff. Mm-hmm. But I thought that there was still some new ways to approach the material. The job wasn't quite done. Yeah. And because of the pandemic, I didn't get a chance to tour on the material at all, or really get a chance to sort of give a sending off into, the twilight before launching the next stage of the band. So I wanted to bring in all these other remixers and composers and digital artists to take the songs and turn them into something brand new. Yeah.
Very cool. And it's a great record with a lot of really immersive songs. Especially the one you assigned me. I'm glad you assigned that one to me because I had a field day with it. So what we wanted to do is go under the hood and explore some of the sounds I made with this and talk about the aspects of the original I used to structure this remix. But before we go into that, we wanted to talk about remixes in general, the history of remixes. It's an interesting thing that's pretty much ubiquitous in the modern music landscape.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that there are two types of remixes, basically, when you break it down. And both of them are all over the place, to your point. One of them is probably even more frequent than people realize, which is the first category, the functional remix. Mm-hmm. So that's when, say, a song needs to be mixed in a certain way to balance for a new medium. So say the Beatles, they're reissuing a particular Beatles record on a new format, going from cassette to vinyl or from vinyl to CD to MP3, what have you. And so in order to do that, you would need to remix the original music, sometimes just to split it into stereo instead of mono. Other times actually just changing the mastering of it, the balancing of it, just to make it sit better in the new medium that it's been transported to. And that's continued years and years and years. Basically, anytime that an album gets reissued, there's a good chance that it's probably going to be remixed to some degree.
Yes. Cool. And it's not, it's not a new creative work per se. Exactly. And then, which brings us to the second.
Exactly. So the second is when you start remixing to make the song not functionally different, but interpretively different. Yeah. A song that would be, if you were to show both mixes to someone, they could very easily identify this version is one song. This version, even though it may share a lot of the same materials, is something else entirely.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's something that you really start to see happen as like dance music starts to develop in the 70s. It's really a practice that comes out of responding to the way the audiences are listening to music and then remixing the music to better suit the audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure, we get intimations of this type of thing in music history where you have a previous work that's recontextualized in a new work. That's like a broad, maybe that's the most broad conception of remix we can think of. But remix proper, like you're talking about, really, what was it in the 70s with disco? Is that when disco started to emerge?
Oh yeah, that's like the disco decade for sure.
Yes.
Is the 1970s. And what's happening is, the DJs who are spinning these records would look out into the crowd and would see like, oh, they're really going at it for this particular part. We got to keep this going. If we change this, people are going to be bummed, and that's not good for business. So let's loop this back around or come up with a new mix of this particular dance track that's going to keep people on the floor for longer.
Yeah. So in a sense, there is still a functional aspect in that regard.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the difference is that in order to achieve that functional goal, the actual form changes as well.
Good point.
You know what I mean?
Good point. Yeah.
I like that you're pointing out that this isn't entirely specific to like modern recorded music.
Yeah.
Like this idea of reinterpretation and recontextualization, it's like the entire history of music is basically based on that idea.
I mean, I know the Middle Ages in Europe, taking early chants from like hundreds of years ago and putting them in new mass settings and stuff like that. You know, the monks were doing it, man. If the monks were doing it, it's pretty OG.
I mean, folk songs.
Yeah, exactly.
You take the same chord progression and basic structure, but change the lyrics to fit, you know, the circumstances of the day, whatever the folk wanted to be singing about at that moment. Or even, you know, moving forward in history, jazz music is essentially that same process of what I was just describing with disco, but on acoustic instruments.
Totally.
You know, jazz music was dance music before it was anything else.
Exactly.
And so you'd have these bands be like, oh, well, people still want to dance, so I guess we better loop the form a few more times. And, well, I'm getting a bit bored of playing it the same way every single time, so why don't I take a solo? And boom, jazz, you know?
Totally. It's all essentially this type of thing we're talking about. And would you say it kind of, you know, let's track it to the present, remixes of the present, especially within the realm of like, I don't even know if it's limited to electronica or like sample-based music anymore, but I'm seeing a lot of artists, some of my favorite artists who are just releasing remix albums, where there's maybe the functional aspect is attenuated a bit. It's more about just creating this new emergent work from materials from the original.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, I think that this really starts to ramp up in the 80s once it goes from just people making remixes basically through the manipulation of vinyl technology and through recording technology to digital sampling technology.
Yes.
And that kind of just blows the doors open.
Yeah. And I was with this particular remix, I was very aware of like just the possibilities that a DAW, a digital audio workstation, gives you. It's limitless. It's almost too much.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, well, that's always the interesting thing is like the way that a remix is the confines come from the track itself.
Yeah.
Like how much you want to have some degree of fidelity with the original song versus creating something entirely new. I mean, you know, you can look at the history of the word remix, and in the 90s when hip hop sort of becomes like the dominant emergent popular form in Western music, you see the remix kind of take on not too dramatic of a change, but it would be like someone like you would have a new featured artist would come onto the song and that would qualify as a remix, you know? So you would get like, oh, let's get these different rappers from this different part of the country to come on the song to expand the audience of the track more. So that's pretty narrowly the same, but it still is changing the song in some ways. But then once like that kind of idea starts getting picked up by rock bands who are, you know, then influenced by hip hop, you start to have these like really radical changes being done to rock songs, basically filtered through digital technology and coming out wildly mutated on the other end of it. And I think that's the tradition that this remix of Deep Despair in Covington, Kentucky really comes from.
And I think there, you know, there are different levels of remix, right? Or different standards you can adhere to. I know some people, when they're doing this, they only want to use the materials they're dealing with are only materials from the original, which is kind of cool. That's not what I did. I did a mixture of both. I actually used actual samples from the original, but also just added, you know, augmented it with my own virtual instruments and stuff like that. So I did a mixture of both. So it's the DNA is not all you, so to speak. But it would be cool to set that limitation to see what would happen. I just didn't do it for this. Yeah.
Right. I mean, sometimes like even just the conceptual limitation of like, it has to be some version of this song, whether or not it's made out of the same, you know, you might be cooking the same dish, but with different ingredients.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
That's a great analogy for sure.
In particular, I want to sort of lay out the lineage that I'm drawing from as a metal artist, because I'm very influenced. I'm 30 years old, so I grew up in the age age of industrial metal in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, Nine Inch Nails and Linkin Park and all that kind of stuff really has a lot of formative influence on me. And I think that rock bands kind of shied away from doing remixes after a while because a lot of that sort of stuff is looked on as maybe being a bit passé and corny. But luckily, I think the tide of history has sort of turned around. And now there's this whole another wave of artists with like early 2000s nostalgia. You have like 100 Gex doing remix albums with like the members of Fall Out Boy on it and stuff like that. And I think that the culture is kind of returning to this place of fusion between genres and the dissolution of boundaries between genres. And remixes are a really powerful way to access that.
Totally. I mean, they're a very clear manifestation of polystylism, I would say. Mm-hmm. Very postmodern, in a way.
Absolutely. In the sort of Derrida sense, like there is no interpretation that can bring interpretation to an end. That was like the big mantra for this record for me. Yeah. And having this ability to throw these songs out to you and to all the other people I worked with and have them come back completely different, I think breathes all this new life into the material. Yeah,
it's a very interesting and fascinating creative endeavor, I would think, especially for you, just receiving them back and be like, whoa, I'm sure kind of looking for samples of your own work in it, like kind of finding them, kind of like a treasure hunt type thing. I'm sure it was really fun.
Yeah, I mean, luckily I'm so familiar with the original recordings because
it was probably really easy for you, right? Myself. Yeah.
It's actually made me realize like, oh, it's what is this person going to pick out? What do they think is interesting?
In the original song? That gives you insight into their personality or their biases.
Mm-hmm. And absolutely, it's a really invigorating process. I found this was like the easiest for me because all I had to do was send some emails to put this album together.
Lucky,
but also incredibly rewarding to hear the results come back.
I have one question before we go into it. What factors led to the decisions for each person? Which song would be coupled with each artist?
Oh, I definitely was thinking kind of along two lines, like what I wanted to happen to the song, but also I wanted to consider the strengths of each of the people that I was sending it to. So for this song in particular, with Deep Despair, this was like the most sound design focused song on the record to me. It's the one where we really worked the hardest to create these like, the whole like first chunk of the song, it's just a single melodic idea with just more and more layers being added to it. And in order to make that work on a record, you really have to kind of dial in exactly what sort of sounds you want.
You have to engineer the sounds. Yeah.
And like push them into places where they don't just sound like, now I'm playing notes on an organ. We want it to be like something completely unique. And that's something that I found in your music as well as Noumenah, is you can maybe pick out what the original sound source is, but the result is the interesting thing.
Yes,
the thing that
it's emergent. Yeah.
All
right, so let's get into the remix itself. I wanted to go over my approach in the beginning. So I wanted to just, listen to your song and really pick out the aspects that kind of were salient to me, that moved me more or just stuck out to me more, or aspects that seemed structurally foundational from your perspective. And the first thing I noticed was the kick drum ostinato, which permeates through most of it, right? The original?
Yeah, that's really the organizing
it's the
principle.
Yeah,
the whole song.
Yeah. So
that was kind of the exercise when I started writing it, is like, how much can I get out of this one repeating kick drum pattern?
Exactly. So that backbone was apparent to me. So I definitely wanted to have that. And then towards around the final minute of the song, there's a progression in C minor, very beautiful progression. And I'm a sucker for those types of progressions. So, of course, I wanted to develop that, but I wanted to have it throughout the whole remix rather than the tail end climax. I knew though I knew I wanted the climax to include that progression in a more fully blossomed capacity. And then so specific timbres stood out to me too, the organ and cello drones, which are in the beginning and sprinkled throughout, if I recall.
The organ was the main starting point.
Yes,
That's what we originally did was I had like a MIDI organ from GarageBand.
Yeah.
The early 2010s that I had, that's layered under there with this like weird synth kind of hiss up top that we really liked. And then we took the organ that we had in the studio at the time and played the same part, but then pitched it an octave down.
Yeah.
So you could hear the rotation inside of the organ really, really clearly. So it kind of sounded like you were pushing a rock up a hill, which is kind of
beautiful.
the big thematic thing from the record Sisyphean.
And I noticed that almost beating, undulating aspect of that organ and the cello or whatever when they were played together. And I made a note of that because I made I sampled the cello and made a virtual instrument. I kind of mapped it on the keyboard via Contact. And I also ran it through my 4-track recorder just to imbue it with some tape artifacts, and also re-record it back into my DAW, modulating the pitch just a little bit to give it a beating sound, which was inspired by the original kind of rotating whatever you were talking about.
Right.
So that was like a main part, and it manifests in the song as almost like a heavy riff. There's 2 points where this heavy riff comes in, and it's actually the cello you're hearing, but there's an LFO that's like modulating the amplitude, so it sounds like some sort of crazy synth, but it comes from the cello sample.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
Yeah. I'm just using this plugin called LFO tool, which it'll like I said, modulates the amplitude, so it'll duck out periodically, and it's sounds like some sort of synthesizer. But yeah, that's definitely all over the place, or at least in 2 critical parts, not all over the place. I'm getting ahead of myself. Also, one other aspect I wanted to talk about was you sent me a recording of you reading the lyrics, kind of a spoken word thing, and your window was open and there was like birds. I actually had a field day with that recording. Let me just let's just begin the deep dive with this.
Sure.
I keep thinking that I see mountains in the distance.
Right.
Shrouded in blue.
So it sounds like a poetry reading, but there are birds chirping in the background. So I decided to make this kind of grist for some high frequency textures. And I basically recorded different parts of this on my 4-track recorder, but on a tape cassette loop. So what you get is this, which is in the beginning. So we're just going to start with the beginning texture. So those little bleep bloops are actually the birds. I just did some surgical EQing. And then you can hear Ian's voice kind of undulating because it's a tape loop. This served as most of the high frequency ambient textures you hear throughout the piece, which was cool. And I'm glad that worked out because you just kind of thought of it on a whim.
Well, this is almost like another case of limitations breeding creativity, where for whatever reason, the stems that I sent you didn't have the vocals included.
Oh, okay.
And so I was just like, well, I'll just re-record me doing the lyrics, spoken words. And so I'm practically speaking them in the original anyway. And as it just so happened, there were birds outside. It was very hot and I needed the windows open to keep cool.
Yeah.
And so happy accidents.
Yeah, totally. Let's go into the first section here. I want to talk about which aspects of the original I used to structure it. So this is the first iteration of that C minor progression. There's also guitar. I made guitar loop textures out of samples of actual guitar parts from the stems you gave me. And then the spoken word loops, and then the bird textures. And what we have is this beginning. So, what's articulating that main progression and what is really an integral sound to this remix is this virtual instrument I created. I can actually play it right here. So it's the simplest way to make a virtual instrument in Kontakt. Literally just one sample of a vocal tone from a choir sample library. I put it through my 4-track recorder, saturated it a bit, re-recorded it, and just you map it out on the keyboard. It's just one sample. So what happens is you get this, but because it's mapped out on the whole keyboard, right, you can play anything you want. And because it's the same sample, it's stretched down and upwards, so you get the loop going at different speeds, which adds to the complexity of the texture. And it gives it a lo-fi sound, but if that lo-fi sound is admitted in your aesthetic, it's totally fine. Because usually when sample libraries or virtual instruments are made, they're deeply sampled. There's so many different samples, and there's a lot of scripting going in. But if you go into my Kontakt, it's super simple. It's literally one sample, just spread out the whole keyboard. Anyways, so there's that part. Okay, so then the next part is the introduction of the kick ostinato. And the kind of cello dirty synth I was talking about. Let's start from here. So it's a pretty heavy sound, and it's really all that the cello. And the reason why it's so heavy is because I sampled it on that 4-track recorder, and you can overdrive it, and there's a natural distortion that occurs, and it's really pleasing on the Tascam. And it's just like it's a heavily distorted version of your cello part, but I have that LFO tool that's kind of automated at different points to almost give kind of like a rippling effect at certain junctures.
Yeah. The way it kind of adds this like triplety rhythm kind of thing to it, almost,
and
which is really cool because that's not in the original at all. That's a totally new thing that you added to the song.
And I want to show you what it sounds like without that LFO tool. Really cool plugin, by the way, LFO tool. Let me see here. Yeah, this in the session it's called Main Dirty Synth. So that's like a sustained cello note with the LFO tool. So let's check it out without the LFO tool. It's just a sustained cello loop. And there's subtle pitch modulation I did on the Tascam as well, but you put on the LFO tool, creates rhythms, right? And you can just automate these rhythms. And in this case, it was very much composed on my part. I went in and basically upped the rate at certain cadence points, brought down the rate at certain cadence points, just to create these ever-evolving rhythmic textures based off of that one cello thing. And the build was very cool because I could really go crazy with the beating between certain tones, cueing off of what you were doing with the cello, and then climaxing into a final iteration of the progression. So we'll just go through that. This is my take on the EDM build or soar. I'm sorry. I just love how I I forgot the vocal excerpt as there's a name for that, right? Where it's just like it builds and then there's like
The
a
sample,
vocal, the
right.
sample. Yeah.
It's like a classic metalcore trick
Yeah.
and have like the sample right before the breakdown.
I hope you at least smiled the first time you heard that.
Oh, I burst out laughing. You picked like the perfect lyric for it.
Yeah.
Too.
Also,
like the most dramatic.
Yeah,
thing I
very
said.
dramatic. There's some drama here, and yeah, let's just hear the kind of climax of the progression.
Well, one thing I wanted to note before that is, did you also brought in a bit of the like descending guitar and piano line that's in the original song, kind of too in the background?
Yeah, yes, you're right. You're right. I forgot to mention that. The dun 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 dun, that part, and that actually comes back at the very end. The kind of redemptive. Oh, there's still hope, and the da 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 is there. It's just, I think it's on like a synth or something, a celeste, but it's doing the same line as those guitars were doing. But yeah, let's check out that climax.
One day at a time.
And before the next, go ahead.
Structurally, this is the part of the song that feels the most like the original to me.
Yes,
because this is like almost taking place of the original climax.
Exactly.
And then is setting up the same kind of like heavy breakdown part.
At the
end of the song.
Totally. And I decided to develop that rhythmic ostinato just a little bit. I kind of expanded it at certain points. And then, so right from that, or from there, it goes right back into, it's a version of what we were hearing earlier with the LFO cello thing. But it's definitely, I would call it like a breakdown. Definitely really heavy sounding. And I developed the rhythmic ostinato even more. But there's still the backbone. Boom. Boom.
You got some extra like 808s.
Yeah. The 808s are I definitely use the 808 in this. That's all I'm gonna say. That's all that needs to be said. Let's hear. I actually this part going into the breakdown I think it's one of my favorite parts. It was inspired by the original, going kind of descending back into like this kind of darker vibe. It was definitely inspired by that.
Right.
Deep despair. So let's take a listen to that. That Tascam creates nasty sounding distortion. Seriously, it's definitely unique, and it sounds pleasing on the ears. Like if I were to run those samples through like a digital plugin, it wouldn't sound the same. It's just like these overdriven circuits of this like cheap Tascam thing. But I was pleased with the result. But yeah.
Sometimes you got to go lo-fi, go hi-fi, man. That's just the way it goes.
And lo-fi sounds are definitely a part of the palette in a lot of these songs, but it's definitely not the whole thing. Like a lot of the sounds aren't lo-fi. I like the lo-fi stuff to be just an aspect. You know what I mean? I know lo-fi is totally in, but yeah. I like for it to be an aspect.
Going back to like the cooking metaphor, it's like that's just some spice that you're throwing on top. It's not the meat itself,
But cool, yeah. I mean, those are basically the parts I wanted to dive into.
Well, I'm curious about why you chose that particular lyric from the batch that I sent you.
For the drop lyric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just looking for ones that would work as a drop lyric, and also that were lyrically, ones that were lyrically that would stick with people. I mean, the lyric is "The future dies."
The future dies one day.
The future dies one day at a time. Like I read that over and over, and it gets you thinking because it's an interesting group of words, and it definitely puts you in an interesting conceptual philosophical space. So I thought it was intriguing, to be honest.
Yeah, it is kind of like the hammer line of the original song, and it's the one that can sort of stand on its own a bit more. Because like the darkest parts of the song is the ending bit where it's implied that whoever is singing the song is being crushed to death by nature.
Yes.
But that's a bit more abstract.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sort of saying like.
And I was aware of those lyrical themes, and I wanted this kind of crushing effect, and that's why a lot of the parts have that heavy undulating. You know what I mean? I wanted that, but of course, in Noumenah fashion, I had a little bit of the end is a little bit more hopeful. Like you're not totally beat down, you're not dead. You know what I mean? That was my little spin. That was my little spin.
That's why I love this particular remix, is because it turns what I think is like one of the darker and like more fatalistic songs on the record, and instead says like, well, what if this is a hopeful message instead? Because like that same lyric, you could also interpret it as like, if the future dies one day at a time, that's like all the more reason to seize it while it's still here, you know?
It's very existential philosophy comes to mind. All those existentialists. I mean, even Nietzsche comes to mind. But you know, he influenced existential philosophy. I mean, you can consider him one of the progenitors, but he was a progenitor for a lot of things.
Yeah. For many things, that's for sure. I mean, Camus was absolutely the guy
I know you.
Like drawing.
Yeah, I mean,
time for this particular.
Yeah, the name of the album. Yeah, I didn't want to go totally like technical and granular with like how I created the sounds. I wanted just to be like a video of like, just kind of like an introduction to the world of this particular remix and like the processes behind it. So I don't think I have anything else to go over.
I mean, I guess it's worth noting that the guitars were played by our mutual friend, Mike Lambert, who, you know, huge part of both of our musical backgrounds in Chicago.
So his spirit is definitely in this.
For sure. You know, going through this song by itself right now, obviously has a lot of benefits. You can sort of hear the way that the song's changed and all of that. But to me, what makes this so cool is that it's flowing in and out of all this other stuff too. Like it's not an isolated thing. It is like the title of the remix record is You Can't Do This Alone. And so even if all of these songs were created separately, it's like the album is what happens when we all work together.
Of course. And you know, it was created amid a pandemic. That's a whole other dimension, right?
Definitely adds some heavier weight to that drop lyric for sure.
For sure. But yeah, cool.
Well, of course we got to plug everything.
Yes. You go first.
So yeah, You Can't Do This Alone comes out on April 9th. I'm releasing it myself, so you can just go straight to lamniformes.bandcamp.com to pre-order it. Or if you're watching in the future when it's already out, grab it. It's digital only for the moment. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, lamniformes.substack.com. And I'm sure Andrew will include my social media links in the description down below as well.
Awesome. Cool. I don't think I have anything to plug, so because I'm a part of it, so I'm part of the remix album, so
like, comment, and subscribe.
Please subscribe.